Mr. Minister Untersteller, Professor Edenhofer, dear Ms. Clarkson, dear Mr. Alex, dear Mrs. Zimmermann, dear Mr. Gehlhaar, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of climate protection, welcome here today in the representation of Baden-Württemberg at the federal government. Welcome to our Summer Academy, which this year we have been organizing for the 5th time in order to deal with the questions of energy transition and climate protection. In recent years, we increasingly looked at energy transition and focused on this, and we talked about technological questions. And this year, we decided to just look out of the box a little bit, to look at the meaning behind the wind turbine, the global aspects, and to link them with the regional challenges, regional initiatives for international climate protection. And as in previous years, we again managed to get very renowned and high-ranking members of the panel and speakers for the panels that will be dealing with the various issues this afternoon. Franz Untersteller, I welcomed him. Professor Edenhofer, I already welcomed him. Ms. Zimmermann, I welcomed they. And Mr. Gehlhaar, they are all the people who work on a practical level with the topics of energy transition and climate protection and initiatives for climate protection. We're also extremely happy that we're not only going to be talking on the panels and in the plenary sessions with the experts, but also have initiatives that are presenting their products and their initiatives in the lobby. And that is a great pleasure for us, that this year we'll have the opportunity to talk to the people who initiated concrete projects. And you can see the whole topic of climate change, climate protection has not lost any significance. At least we are very happy that once again we managed in the Summer Academy to provide a forum for this topic. Ladies and gentlemen, when 1 year ago, that's when my colleagues started 1 year ago to start planning this event, nobody had any idea how clear and how terrible the impacts of climate change are being presented to us. The terrible hurricanes that impacted the Caribbean and devastated the southern states of the United States. Huge monsoon rains in Asia, in Bangladesh, in China. Again, almost every evening shows what is actually going to be facing us. And on the other hand, the extreme drought in the southern part of Europe, with the huge wildfires that broke out everywhere. These are all phases of the climate crisis. So I think that in the opinion of those who deal with these phenomena on a scientific level, these are just the precursors of the dramatic events that we might be facing. So that is why I'm very happy that we've got Professor Dr. Edenhofer here today, who is going to be giving the keynote in a minute. And he, I'm sure, will be talking about the dramatic developments that are confronting us. And he will take us into greater depth. But irrespective and independent of all of that, it is clear that the climate crisis is global. Everywhere, worldwide, we can feel, I just said it, and you can see it every evening, that worldwide the events are taking place which can be considered to be the impacts of the climate crisis and are devastating our environment. And I think we know and can feel it more and more that we can only solve this crisis on an international level. And that is why we tried to take a global view and look at or include the international perspective. And that is why it is a great honor for us that we managed to attract Ms. Clarkson from the climate group in London and Mr. Ken Alex from the governor's office, Brown in California. And we're very happy that we can welcome them here, and also Monika Zimmermann from the World Secretary of ICLEI.
Really an honor for us to have
Herzlich
you here,
willkommen
and
an
we really
Sie.
appreciate
Wir freuen uns
that we can
wirklich sehr,
discuss
dass
those
Sie heute
themes
gekommen
with you,
sind,
those
diese Themen
issues
mit
with
uns
you.
zu besprechen.
Anders als bei den
Contrary to
internationalen
the
Gipfeltreffen,
international summits, which without doubt are important as well, we didn't only put this focus, but we always wanted to give the practitioners and those people who are working on an everyday level and make sure that what is being decided on an international level can actually also be implemented on a day-to-day basis. And we all know how important these international accords and agreements are, how important level playing fields are in order to be able to take action. But we haven't actually saved any greenhouse gas in doing so. The local measures are important, by means of which these targets can actually be achieved. If many young or small people in small places do a lot of small things, then this could change the face of the world, as is an African proverb. And this is exactly the perspective that we want to take a look at today. And this is becoming more and more important, without doubt. And if we hear from the White House that climate change is almost a fake news and basically isn't happening, then I think one must not be allowed to become resigned. And we have to look at other institutions and players in order to fill the gap and to create the alliances with these other institutions in order to fight global warming. But we don't only have to look across the Atlantic. I think there's quite a lot that is happening in front of our own front door. Unfortunately, we have to note that in Germany, since 2005, the CO2 emission hasn't gone down substantially, and the climate targets that we set ourselves for 2040, 40% reduction compared to 1990, are very questionable as to whether they can be achieved. So we in Germany are very far away from being a role model. In North Rhine-Westphalia and in Lusatia, we still have the biggest coal-fired power plants and coal mines in Europe. We have an agriculture that accounts for 30% of the CO2 emissions and continues to focus on mass rather than neutral biomass, and electric mobility was a big topic here in Germany recently, and that is really not making any progress either. So there is quite a lot that we can't only do on an international level, but also have to do locally. And we in Baden-Württemberg, and especially Franz Untersteller and our Minister President Winfried Kretschmer, are certainly not becoming resignated. They have looked for global alliances, and in California with Governor Brown and with Alex, they found somebody who was prepared to create an alliance across the Atlantic, and they managed in May 2015 to create the Under 2 coalition, which since then, i.e. in 2.5 years, covers 170 regions who have become members, 1.2 billion people, 37% of the global economy are represented here, and in this region with a gross national product of 27.5 trillion US dollars. So regions have got together who really represent an economic power, who really have economic structures which need to be grappled with and where something can be changed. And this alliance is not just an abstract agreement, it is a network of regions. It's a platform which invites people to exchange opinions and to look at what measures the other person has taken, and actually also keep a focus on the small things. It is significant whether in regions the street and road lighting is exchanged and replaced by LEDs. If that is done in all these regions, then certainly this would have an effect and impact, and that is why this coalition is a platform, and it is a good network for that. in order to have an exchange. But we also know that on a regional level, we can't reach this aim with the political institutions on their own. We need civil society, we need the economy, and that is why I'm very, very happy that we have the environmental technology Baden-Württemberg and the Society for International Cooperation. These are partners who are going to enter into discussion with us today, and Ms. Tanja Gönner, the CEO speaker of the GIZ, will be coming later in order to have discussions with us. And the Environmental Technology Baden-Württemberg (WTB) shows that with its resource efficiency, a state-of-the-art, basically, a site such as Baden-Württemberg can achieve and implement the climate protection targets, and they can be implemented in these big economic processes and actually make climate targets achievable. And the GIZ shows us how it works internationally in the underdeveloped countries and develops visionary climate protection projects and makes small contributions on a small level so that climate protection is implemented in development work and is part of the growth pattern in these regions. And what on the one hand is the highly efficient light arc for steel production, on the other side one has the efficient cooking area in the bush in Africa. And I think both sides are important to achieve climate protection. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that you will have interesting and inspiring discussions today, and I hope that the one or the other project can be initiated, maybe that we learn a lot of new things from each other and that we network together and have discussions together in order to start something. Obama said in 2014 that we are the first generation who will feel the impacts of climate change, and we are the last generation that can do something to counteract it. So, having said that, I'm very happy that you all came here this afternoon. And before the two initiators of the Under 2 coalition speak, Minister President Kretschmer and Governor Brown will speak. They're actually here, not in person, but on the screen and in spirit. I would like to say I hope you enjoy this afternoon, and afterward our moderator, Mr. Volker Angres, will take you through the afternoon. So I'm very happy you all came. I hope you will have an inspiring, interesting afternoon, and above all that we'll continue to fight climate change. We are in highly political times. We all know that this is one of the most important topics that the next federal government in Germany will have to tackle. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is already taking place. Climate protection, therefore, is extremely urgent, and fast and resolute action is absolutely urgent. The regional level, from my point of view, can play a very important contribution because especially here, concrete measures can be implemented. The targets of the Paris Climate Accord and its signing, which a lot of states participated in, is very important for worldwide climate protection. The 2 degree is the limit. If we don't achieve this target, it would have disastrous impacts on our planet and on us all. And for the future, what is important is that we jointly achieve the ambitious targets for climate protection. We as a land want to show our worldwide partners that the Under 2 coalition is not a closed society, but other regions and cities should benefit from the experience and the existing know-how. I'm very happy that the Under 2 MOU obtained 2 new supporters. This evening we are going to welcome Lower Saxony and Rhineland-Palatinate in our circle. So I would like to welcome them very warmly, which means 8 of 16 federal länder have become a member of the Under 2 MOU and support the 150 countries that are already represented in this alliance. That shows how committed the regional level is for international climate protection. And that is the topic of your event today. I hope you all have a very successful evening with interesting conversations and meetings. Ich wünschte, ich könnte heute bei Ihnen sein, aber ich bin im Geiste bei Ihnen. Die Arbeit, die Sie machen hinsichtlich des Klimawandels, ist sehr, sehr wichtig. Und unser Bündnis Kalifornien und Baden-Württemberg ist wirklich fundamental. Wir reagieren auf die große Bedrohung des Klimawandels in einer sehr signifikanten Art. Fast 180 subnationale Gerichtsbarkeiten weltweit, die mehr als 1 Milliarde Menschen repräsentieren, sind zusammengekommen und haben sich verpflichtet, dem Under-2-Ziel. Also das heißt eine 85-prozentige Reduzierung des CO2-Ausstoßes.
It's a steep hill we have to climb, but we have no choice. And we can't wait for those who are kind of slacking off or who want to deny it or who watch fake news every day. We have to be aware, develop the science, the technology, and most of all the political commitment to do what is necessary. What you're doing at this conference is a very important part of that. We join with you in spirit, and hopefully next September, if you can come to California, we'll be together with the rest of the world and the United Nations in reaffirming the Under 2 commitment to really deal with climate change and the way it must be dealt with. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you hadn't given us applause or given these 2 gentlemen an applause yourselves, I would have asked you to do so. These are the 2 founders of Under 2 MOU. I'm very happy that I can take you through this Summer Academy for the 2nd time. And believe me, this is a very, very hot topic. Not only because we're talking about global warming, but because in an unprecedented way, this has also actually become a part of the German election campaign. You just have to see what the NGOs are telling the automobile manufacturers. So if you read that, you will know what I'm talking about. Mr. Ratzmann already mentioned we are experiencing a phase of tremendously strong hurricanes in America, Florida, Texas, and the Caribbean. They are hugely impacted, and there's nobody here who would say that hurricanes were created by climate change. That's wrong, because they always existed. But the intensity that we're experiencing at the moment really has to make us listen. That is very unusual, and the formula for that is the warmer the oceans are, the more energy is available for these hurricanes. And that is exactly what we're experiencing at the moment. But a few things are being forgotten. It's the parallelity of the events, the concurrence. In Asia, we've got monsoons that are extraordinary as well, and they're almost not at all covered by the German media. The number of victims is extremely high there as well. We had disastrous droughts in Spain and in Italy, and after that, we had flash floods and huge rains. And a personal experience at that time when we had the hurricanes in the United States, I was there. I was in California, in San Francisco at the time. And anybody who's been there, most of the tourists after 2 days go into a department store and buy hoodies. That's what you buy in San Francisco because it's very cold, it's foggy, the city is at the Pacific. I was allowed to experience the hottest day in San Francisco ever recorded since 1874. that's when temperatures started to be recorded, and the temperature was 41.1 degrees centigrade. That is really hard, and you can see that the gentlemen in the women were wearing shorts, and some of the ladies were walking around in San Francisco in bikinis. And that shows that that really was the hottest day. So the damage is accumulating $30 to $40 billion. For Irma alone, that probably won't be sufficient. $5 to $15 billion in the Caribbean. These figures are just first estimates as well. And then the monsoon victims in Southeast Asia. That will account for a lot of money. And I think it's becoming more and more clear that the damages caused by climate change really become a macroeconomic factor. And my opinion, as somebody who's been observing these events for quite a long time, is that most of the politicians are very well advised if they actually started to count properly and do their sums properly. And the chief economist of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the MCC as well. He's here today. Welcome, Professor Edenhofer, and let me hand over to you.
Sehr geehrter Herr Minister, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ladies and gentlemen, well, I would like to thank you for the invitation to the representation of the Federal State of Baden-Württemberg to the capital. Well, you can probably notice, well, the German listeners probably notice the migration background of my biography. I come from the south. I come from Baden-Württemberg, and well, originally my family comes from Bavaria, but then we moved to Baden-Württemberg, and I probably speak the accent of Baden-Württemberg now and no longer of Bavaria. And now I live in Potsdam. Well, so let's talk about optimists. Social scientists say that optimists, on average, are less successful. Pessimists are really successful, because in order to be successful, you need to have some paranoia, or a certain degree of paranoia. You have to have a certain idea of what of those things that can go wrong, and therefore successful managers are not free from paranoia and not free from pessimism. Well, I would define myself as an emotional optimist and a rational pessimist. So if you come from the southwest of this country, then you can't really be a pessimist, because life is quite good there, but you still have to be a rational pessimist. So my presentation today will be characterized by this rational pessimism, and then in the end I will conclude on an optimistic note, but because I feel there's no reason to give up or to resign, to be full of resignation, but what we have to do is to get started now, and for that we need a clear analysis of the situation. That is what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes. So, well, if I was able to continue with my slides here, then I would be quite happy. So maybe somebody can help me with the slides. So I can't really run through my slides here. Gut, macht jetzt nichts.
So, well,
ich habe meine Folien im Kopf.
No problem, because after all I know my slides by heart. So I want to start with the following.
Wenn man sich das mal anschaut, wie
So
sich
if you have a
die
look at
weltweiten Emissionen entwickelt
how
haben, und ich bin sehr dankbar
emissions
in diesem
have
Zusammenhang,
developed the world over,
dass,
and here I'm very
Sie
grateful
sich heute das Thema der globalen
that
Energiewende
you are dealing with the
zuwenden.
topic of global
Dann stellen wir
energy
Folgendes
transition.
fest. today. So if we have a look at the development of global emissions, we can see that between 2000 and 2014 we had a period with the strongest growth of emissions. Every year there was an increase of about 2%. And since 2014 we have now had the third consecutive year in which global emissions seem to have stabilized. So you will probably agree with me. So we have 2 to 3 figures so far. Of course, you will probably agree that you cannot really read a trend or deduct a trend from 2 to 3 figures. But here we can say that in China, for the first time, emissions became more stable, well after they reached a pretty high level. So now my PowerPoint presentation works, it seems, and so this is the only commercial that we are having, but I just want to mention that everything that I'm saying here is written in a book that I wrote, only 123 pages, and you can also, so the book only costs €8.85, and you can also download the slides that are included in the book from the internet. So much with regard to my commercial here, my advertising, but I worked a year on this book, and so I just wanted to inform you that you can buy this book. So we had this enormous increase in emissions, and now we have some degree of stabilization, but a stabilization is not really sufficient, and I want to explain this slide to you here. So on the y-axis you can see the cumulative emissions. So these are the emissions that we have given into the atmosphere since the period of industrialization, and this accumulation is the decisive factor for the increase of our temperature, and it is decisive for the damage that we have to expect. And the black line, these are the emissions that we will have to expect if we continue as before, and then in 2037 we would reach the 2% target, so it's not much time left. So if, starting from tomorrow, because today we are meeting here, so if tomorrow the emissions will be reduced by 2%, we will still reach the 2% limit pretty soon. So only if we manage to reduce CO2 emissions by 4% every year, we stand a chance to reach the 2% target, or 2-degree target rather, at the end of the century. So far, a reduction of this dimension is something that we have never managed to reach. So I'm saying this because people say, well, it's a good piece of news that we stabilized emissions, but I want to stress that that is not sufficient. So if you have a look as to how this is distributed across the countries, so maybe we can say in China the emissions have stabilized. I have some doubts about that. In the United States, you see a reduction of emissions, a slight emission, because there the coal power plants have been replaced by gas power plants. The European Union has managed to reduce emissions, and India is now in the process of increasing emissions. So if you have a look at the primary energy sources that lie at the foundation of this chart, we can see that for 1,000 years, for the last few years we had a very strong renaissance of coal. So coal is still the most widely used source of primary energy. So at let us look back at the forecasts of the international coal agencies at the beginning of the millennium. They all said coal will disappear. So that was the forecast at around the year 2000. And so they said the share of coal will decline, and also the absolute amount of coal will go down. So they expected gas to be the most popular source of primary energy. So you can see coal has dropped a little, but from my point of view, the rumor that that we are going to witness the end of coal are completely overrated, completely exaggerated. It will be one of the big tasks for the next 5 years at a global level to to manage to exit coal and to shift away from coal. And if we don't manage to do that, then we will not reach the 2-degree target. So that is the pessimistic note of my presentation. Coal is still very attractive. So what is our objective? It would be good to reach the 2-degree target. So this is has not been deducted from some kind of physical formula, but it is the temperature beyond which, the temperature increase beyond which there will be major dangers and threats. And if we go beyond these 2 degrees, then we will have more and a larger number of extreme weather conditions and weather events like hurricanes or the melting of permafrost and so on. And so this 2-degree target has been set to remind us that this is the limit, and beyond that everything will become quite difficult. And people say that coral reefs will disappear above if we have a bigger increase than 2 degrees. And others say that there will be also a big economic impact and cold and in very cold and very hot climate zones. Economic activity will be quite difficult, and this is what our colleagues in Stanford calculated, and they calculated the impact of productivity of workers as a result of climate change. So this has to do with services that are marketed on the local or on the global market. So this has nothing to do with coral reefs or whatever hurricanes, but this is what we will be able to measure if the temperature increases. So Europe will probably will not be affected that much. But if you have a look at the Middle East and the Far East and also Africa, we can see that climate change will mean that the unequal distribution of income and economic activity in the world will be increased, and as a result of that, inequality will go up. And if you have a look at how the graph goes down for Latin America or Africa, and what kind of moderate increase we'll have for Europe, you can probably see that climate change will not only increase inequalities in the world, but it will also increase migration. So, and these are socio-economic aspects that we have to keep in mind when we talk about the costs and the dangers of climate change. I do not want to continue to talk about the costs of unhampered climate change, but I now want to turn to where we have to go. So there's an important insight. This insight is that a limitation to 2 degrees obliges us to emit only a limited amount of CO2. The atmosphere has limited capacities with regard to depositing CO2. So only 800 gigatons of CO2 emissions are left that we can deposit in the atmosphere, because the atmosphere has a limited capacity of 3,000 gigatons, and that is and only 800 gigatons are left that we can deposit in the atmosphere, and that is why we are under this enormous time pressure. So we still have 800 gigatons left, but we have 15,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide still as a reserve in terms of fossil fuels in our soil. We won't be able to extract all these gigatons of coal and gas because of the extraction costs, but still, in view of the fact that there are these fossil resources left, climate policy means that so CCS, carbon storage, 70% of the coal has to. So with CCS, we still have to make sure that 70% of the coal will remain in the ground, and with CCS, 90% of. Sorry, the other way around. Without CCS, 90% of the coal will have to remain in the soil. So I can basically see two narratives that people come up with. The first narrative is that people say, well, if wind and solar is so cheap that no person has an incentive to get coal out of the soil, then the coal will stay in the soil. Well, the problem here is that this miracle would have to happen immediately, so tomorrow. So, and if this miracle takes time, if we say that the production costs for energy will go down slowly for alternative energies, then there will have this kind of competition between the sinking costs for fossil fuels and slowly sinking costs of renewables. I think there's no reason that we can expect an increase in the price for fossil fuels in the next few years. So there will be a long period of fairly low prices for gas and carbon and coal. And a climate policy that tries or has to compete, where wind energy has to compete with fossil fuels, with such a climate policy, it will be very difficult to fight climate change. So global, national, and local climate policy has to get some support from market policy. And we can only achieve that if fossil fuels get a market get a price, a CO2 price. So what does a CO2 price mean? It means that the CO2-free energies, renewable energies, are cheaper and get a competitive advantage. And it would make fossil energies more expensive. Fossil energies have to become more expensive, because if they became less expensive due to the use of fossil energies, then we will not manage to get rid of coal in our system. And the same holds true for oil price. A continued low oil price does not make electromobility compatible. Only if the oil price rises and the real cost of carbon energies will be brought to bear, will it be possible for renewables to become competitive. And so far, global climate policy has neglected this aspect, whether this is through tax or through emission trade. But a CO2 price also has a third function. So a CO2 price will lead to income from tax or from auctioning, and you can do useful things with this additional income. So many empirical reviews, we can prove that a CO2 tax becomes quickly acceptable for the population if the population knows what is done with this additional income. So British Columbia is an example. There was a comparatively high CO2 tax that was introduced there, but at the same time, they then also redistributed this CO2 tax equally to the population, to everybody in the country. And this led to an enormous acceptance of the CO2 tax. In states where there's a lot of trust between the population and the people in the government, you can do that, like for example in Sweden, where they use this additional income for infrastructure investment and research. So, but this is the core problem from my point of view. So if we have a look at this in the course of time, what is it that we have to achieve in global terms? So we would have to have a reduction by 4%, and in the second part of the century we would have to be carbon neutral. So this is a global picture, which you can see the charts here. And then we would also need negative emissions. That is a very unpopular topic. Negative emissions means that we take CO2 out of the atmosphere. We will have, it will take us so much time to reduce CO2 emissions that in the end we will need the possibility to withdraw CO2 from the atmosphere. So this includes reforestation, maybe even with artificial trees that withdraw CO2 from the atmosphere. And at the same time, we have to avoid a fear or a hope. Well, these negative emissions does not mean that we do not have to start straight away with an ambitious climate policy. This is inevitable. We have to do that. These negative emissions will become necessary, probably, because there will probably still be residual emissions, and these residual emissions will then have to be compensated through negative emissions. So the Paris Agreement laid down 1.5 degrees. So the situation for 1.5 degrees is so dramatic that today even every tons of CO2 that we emit would have to be compensated. How do we do that? Well, we have to completely change the course with emissions. We have to decarbonize electricity production in the next decades the world over. The transport sector will have to be electrified, and then in addition we also need these compensation technologies. So these are the essential and decisive steps that have to be taken in global climate policy. So, well, what is the position of the Paris Agreement now? I said that we still have 800 gigatons left, only 800 gigatons left. So far, the states put some voluntary obligations on the table in Paris, and that means that until 2030 we can still use 600 gigatons. So a large amount of what the states put on the table will be absorbed by 2030. So in the international climate conferences, but also as a result of the initiatives described here, it is essential that we will have bigger ambitions, more ambitious ambitions, so to say. So the targets of the Paris Agreement are not sufficient to reach the 2-degree climate target. So if you are cynical, you could say that the states in Paris agreed to, well, continue with emissions. So if we have a look at coal, the coal power plants that are planned the world over, in their economic lifetime, they will produce 2,100 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions. And so the revised plans in China and India are taken into account of. So I'll show you the countries where there are more coal power plants planned. So in China, it was said that the plans had been changed and the number reduced. But if we have a look at Turkey, Bangladesh, and others, you can still see that there are many countries that still bank on coal to a large extent. If all these plans for coal-powered power plants will be implemented, it would mean that if these countries agreed to phase out coal power plants, then they would still have to compensate. For example, and one sector where one could change is transport, which would mean that all transport would have to be electrified. And the same holds true for Germany and also internationally speaking. So if these plans for coal-powered power plants will be implemented, then we will never reach this 2-degree target. So, for example, if in Egypt highly efficient coal power plants will be built, we can't expect them to say in 2030 that they will stop their coal power plants, because then they would these power plants would run only for a very short period of time. That would make them too expensive. So what is your belief, or what do you think is the international price of coal? Well, we have an international CO2 price, and that is $150 per ton of CO2. This is a negative price, and So, to put it in negative terms, we subsidize the production of every ton of coal with $150 per year. So the phasing out of coal within the G20 is an indispensable short-term objective in order to get a grip on the climate problem. So in this presentation, I focus on some initial credible steps. And how could we do that? So one could introduce step-by-step CO2 prices. So the industrialized countries would have to go ahead, move forward more quickly, and then the emerging economies, and then starting in 2030, they also would have to increase their CO2 prices drastically. And so if Europe had 50 to 100 euros as a CO2 price, but then, so within the Climate Framework Convention, it would be necessary to have these CO2 price negotiations, and that will be important also in the G20. So for the World Bank, we drafted a report with Nicholas Stern and Mr. Stieglitz, and this is the result of that. We said it would be good if worldwide, everybody at the same time and almost at the same level until 2020, we would have a CO2 price ranging between $40 and $80 per ton. This would be almost in line with the 2-degree objective, and until 2050, a CO2 price of $50 to $100 per ton for CO2. And then, within the framework of the international climate financing, that those countries who couldn't afford that they would get the necessary support, like countries like Nigeria, for example, so that they could introduce a CO2 price that would be sufficient for a fuel switch. And then they need cheap credits and also transfer payments to support them. So you could say, well, CO2 prices, that is our typical outcome of the research of a professor, very theoretical concept. But luckily, such CO2 price concepts are being developed in other countries, for example, in China. I don't know whether that will be successful, but at least it is a step forward. And I would like to close by making some remarks on Europe and on the German energy shift. Well, you could say, well, in Europe we do have an emission market. Well, on this emission market, you can see that the price for the certificates is moving around 5 euros per ton of CO2. So these 5 euros are not sufficient, not at all sufficient, in order to make coal less competitive with regard to gas and for promoting. And so we could say this emission trade has not brought about any advantage for promoting renewable energies. Well, and some critics say, well, that is what people say who do not want to promote renewables. And some people say, well, after all, emission trade has meant that now the emission ceiling or the emission limit has been, the emission cap has been achieved. And well, others say that, and I would say that reaching the cap is not sufficient, it's not good enough. So emission trades all over the world have the same problem. In all emission trade systems, the prices collapse at some stage. And we saw that also with sulfur dioxide. Well, why does this happen? Something interesting happens in the emission trade. That happens if the actual emissions are just below the cap. And this happened in 2008 during the financial crisis. Then suddenly at the emission market you have a surplus. And as soon as you have a surplus there, then the traders start to speculate and they will wonder what the regulators will do, whether they will take the certificates from the market. And if the certificates are taken off the market, then some time later they are again fed into the market. And that is what happened at the European emission market. And then the traders lose trust in the emission trade. And this reduction in the price is not a result of the technological progress of renewables, but this was the result of this. This was triggered by the fact that the traders lost trust in the European climate policy. And not even after Paris did the price go up again. And that is at the core of this problem. So you could say, well, I'm not interested in whether the traders lose trust in European climate policy, because the cap, after all, is defined. But the decisive point is, so let's say for the next 5 to 10 years, the price will stay stable at a very low level. Then people will not really invest into CO2-free technologies. They will stick to coal, and then at some stage the cap will have its impact, and the price goes up then, and the price will go up drastically. Will industry then say, well, that's wonderful, and we'll do something? No, they won't do that. They will say this increase in the price is too strong for us. We can't cope with that. So is that what you do if the speaker has exceeded his time limit? Well, but I'll come to the end of my presentation very soon. So this could mean that the emission trade from that time onwards is no longer a marketplace where the most efficient technologies that avoid CO2 will become more competitive and will have an advantage on the market, but where political decisions come in. And at the moment, I think there's no corrective mechanism for these problems regarding the emission trade. So for us, I think this is avoiding this problem is possible only if we have a CO2 price between 20 to 30 euros per ton, and if this price then increases step by step. What does this have to do with the European energy crisis? So if we had such a, well, no problem, I know my charts by heart. If we had such a CO2 price, then of course this would help the expansion of renewable energies. That would help them dramatically. But there's also another important aspect. If we had such a European minimum price, then, for example, the different member countries of the European Union could all run their own climate policy. If Germany, hopefully in the next parliament, will start phasing out coal, then with a minimum price of 30 euros per ton of CO2, we wouldn't have to fear that our phasing out of coal would be compensated by an increase in coal production in Poland. So that is what we need to do. So we could have such a minimum, introduce such a minimum price, for example, when during the auctions we would allow such a CO2 minimum price. So this brings me back to the beginning. If many small people do lots of small things, then this will lead to a big thing. So of course one could use the quote from Goethe that only do your things and the rest will follow by itself. But at the moment, we have a situation that wherever somebody does an extra effort, like in Baden-Württemberg or in Lower Saxony, then in the European emission trade, this reduces the price. But if we had a minimum price, if we had a pricing system for CO2, then the individual extra efforts would add up to an enormous reduction in CO2 emissions, and I think that is a decisive point. And therefore, I believe we do not only need a debate on the reform of the European emissions trade, but in Germany as well. We also need a new debate on an eco-social tax reform. For me, I think it is impossible that in the medium run, with electromobility, with the transformation of our transport system, we will be successful if we do not change our tax system and reform it to a large extent. In a world where there will be an electricity tax, electromobility will be punished. And well, this brings me to my last important point that I want to hammer home here. In the next decades, we will see low prices for fossil fuels. A climate and energy policy at a regional, national or international level that will take that into account, that does not take this into account, will fail. And we can make German and global energy policy a success if we manage at the different levels, European, national, international, to to actually agree on a CO2 pricing system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Edenhofer. Why don't you come forward? Because you gave us a lot of very hard facts that we need to deal with. And I think today we want to work like in the Memorandum of Understanding. We want to work together. And everybody should have a say. You can ask the questions in a minute, but because we talked about emission trade and because the task is that on an international level we have to sort this out. If it were to work in Germany, which is not the case at the moment, 2.3% CO2 is our share. That is certainly not enough. So it has to work everywhere. In California, Alex, there is an emission trade. Please give us a very short statement. How good or bad does that work in your part of the country?
Right now it's working well. To reduce about 20% of California's emissions of the overall emission reduction. We do have a minimum price that was identified as a good approach. It's right now the market for offsets is about $14,500. It should be higher, but it will be.
Okay. Vielen Dank für diese erste Einschätzung.
Well, thank you very much for that first estimate. That could be a good topic for the Under 2 coalition if they're not working on it already. So I would like to come to you with the microphone. You can ask some questions for Mr. Edenhofer. Is there a macroeconomist anywhere? No? Any questions? I've got a lot of questions if nobody else has any. Please introduce yourself. Nikolaus, who's a political advisor. I've got one question, the question of a minimum price for emissions. That is a variant. Instead of taking the emissions out of the trade, from your point of view, what is the advantage of that to introduce minimum prices and not do it via the reduction of emissions or emission rights and not to talk about that? That is an excellent question. The advantage is the following. The advantage is you take the insecurity for the investors out of the system. If the regulators take certificates out of the market, it always remains unsure what the price reaction will be. And you can see with the market stability research, things are taken out of the market. And then the traders think they're going to be put back into the market later. And you can't do anything against these expectations. And to stabilize these expectations, it makes sense to have a minimum price. And California is an excellent example. We work very closely with the colleagues in California relating to the minimum auction reserve price. That may be the way to go. Some people tell me, well, a minimum price is such a funny economic idea. But I just wanted to give you some empirical data. Great Britain has a terrible climate history, but they introduced a minimum price of 20 euros per ton CO2. And look at the black line for the coal exit or the outphasing of the coal. That was pretty dramatic. So nobody can tell me that the prices don't have an effect. Of course they have an effect. If they can stabilize the expectation that you can see in what a short period of time the phasing out of coal was achieved. So this is a very remarkable development that I wanted to show you. And from my point of view, this can be implemented this way. You wouldn't even need a European agreement on that. You could do it via auction prices. Some countries could form coalitions and then auction at a minimum price, and that way they would dry up the secondary market step by step. That would be possible as well. But I would recommend to look at the Californian emission trade system with the most recent innovations. I think that is exemplary. And I always like to refer to California because people always tell me, if you have a minimum price, this is a typical idea of market interventionists who always want to manipulate the market. No, California did it. This is a market-friendly society. And I don't think it has anything to do with bad interventions. This is excellent economic policy in order to stabilize expectations. I would like to come back to one of your slides. You said that there are many countries where coal is just being increased, the coal-fired power plants. And these are not countries one would think of. Egypt, for example, and Indonesia is forgotten. I forget what the factor was here. So the next climate conference, which will be held in Bonn. And that is a topic that should be discussed at this climate conference, because all the contracting countries of this convention have to be included here. There were attempts, cautious attempts in recent years. What do you think needs to happen in order to create an impulse? The Paris Climate Accord happened in one night. There was a coalition of a few courageous ones, and then we got the climate accord. Could you imagine that something like that would happen with the emission trade issue? Well, as far as the climate framework conditions, every year the countries have their same voluntary self-commitments. And first of all, you want to understand what is actually the common metric. If you look at the indices, for example, Mexico said that they want to increase X% on a non-defined baseline. So one has to become more clear here. So a first step would be if at least one could start to set a metric, and that would be the CO2 prices. That would be a big step to build on that. And the multilateral development banks would assess their investment portfolios according to the CO2 prices. They could just disclose that. It's like a parallel currency. That could be a first step. And once that has been put on the table, one has to say, we've got the Green Climate Fund, which basically makes transfer payments possible. There's not enough money in there yet, but at some point, there is a lot of creative accounting here, but it should have 100 million at some point, and this could be used to support countries which want an increasing CO2 price. And then one could have bilateral agreements for the Kreditanstalt for reconstruction. The Bank for Reconstruction could give good loans. We mustn't forget one thing. We always talked about the prices for the fossil resources, which are, and we didn't talk about the interest rates. For the competitiveness of the renewables, interest rates are fundamental, especially in emerging countries and developing countries. So if we note that interest rates are going to increase, then 3 percentage points would be enough in order to destroy the electricity production prices. We've got a low interest rate phase, and there were hardly any capital costs. Once the capital costs increase again, especially the renewables will be punished. So the CO2 pricing and increased CO2 pricing is necessary for that reason. So there are various reasons why we should do this. And I think in these negotiations it's going to be very difficult. But the agreement on a common metric has to happen at some point. So I think we will just stop here. Professor Edenhofer, thank you very much for this additional information. And I would like to ask the first panel to come onto the stage, please. So, ladies and gentlemen, we want to discuss what we just heard from Professor Edenhofer, and we want to mirror it a little bit. How can we put this into concrete implementations? Who drives what in climate protection? And here we are in a situation where we want to look into the regions and see how we can do climate protection there. So the question is, who's got the best ideas here? And that also applies to you in the audience. You can make your contribution and say whether you know about a great project or whether you might have an idea. All of that is called the Summer Academy, but it is also like a workshop. So we would be very happy if we could collect some ideas which we could note down and which we can then move forward. Let me just present the panel. Helen Clarkson, she is the CEO of the Climate Group in London, and for many this may not be that well known yet. Let me just say Climate Week in New York City. That is what you do, for example, and I think we always get invitations so that I get one as well. Normally I don't have the time and the money to go there, but maybe some other time. And the Climate Group is also the secretariat for the Under 2 Memorandum of Understanding, and that's a very welcome, Helen Clarkson. Monika Zimmermann, she's on the other side. She is the Deputy Secretary General of the ICLEI World Secretariat. I think we don't have to explain to any of you what ICLEI means. 1,500 cities, municipalities, and so on are members of the ICLEI. It has existed since 1989. It was founded for a different reason. It's a sustainability network just to create great ideas between the municipalities, cities, and towns. There are lots of partnerships here. Maybe you can talk about that later. In any case, ICLEI has made the world a little bit better, and maybe you can say more about that. Welcome, Ms. Zimmermann. Andreas Gehlhaar, he's the head of the environmental policy with the German Railway. The new press release that I got on my smartphone today was that the new bullet train between Berlin and Nuremberg has been finished, and you can tell us how that is connected with the protection of the climate. Some people were very negative about this, and maybe we can hear your opinion on that. And I think this is a regional contribution as well. So welcome, Andreas Gehlhaar. Franz Untersteller, I don't think I need to introduce him. He's the Minister for Climate and Energy Economy in Baden-Württemberg. He is also behind the initiative. He is a driving force here as well. And I could hardly believe it. Minister President Kretschmann said it again, 175 or almost 180 regions in only 2.5 years that have become members. So I think that is more than the number of countries who ratified the Paris Climate Accord. So I think this is a huge achievement. So let's say, if you listen to Professor Edenhofer, then you will have heard about the huge challenge that we have. It really is a huge challenge. And let me just pick out one point, Professor Edenhofer. You showed us how coal is going up, that the coal price is going to be low for a long term. And at the same time, everybody's talking about climate protection and CO2 reduction. But without phasing out coal, this will not be possible. So I see a certain problem if you look at reality, just to be put it mildly. So what would you say, Mr. Gehlhaar? How can we deal with this coal paradox? Well, basically, we can't get around the fact that countries are going to be using more and more coal. And Germany is one of those countries. If you look at the history, the emerging countries and developing countries always looked at developing models of the industrial countries. And I can't imagine that it would be different here. And if we can show in a high developed industrial country such as ours that we can secure energy supply at a cheap rate or cost effectively based on renewable energies, efficient gas-powered power plants, then others will follow that path. Why should they not? Because ultimately the events that we saw in recent weeks, you said it You mentioned it, even if we see them, some people will start to think. But we also have to be a role model, and I think we've got the possibility here. Others have the possibility to go down this path, because in a situation the renewables are below the energy generation or energy production costs of coal, for example, and other fossil fuels, I don't know why we should stick to coal. I think that is the major task of the next federal government, to really deal with the topic of the phasing out of coal and also present a plan as to how that could happen. And this is possible. We showed that when we phased out nuclear energy, nobody actually even talks about it. We just do it. And I actually am convinced that we could do it with coal as well. Let me look at this on an international level, Ms. Clarkson. In the climate group, of course, you're talking about coal policy, renewable energies. How is your estimate? How are we worldwide? What position are we in? Can a phasing out of coal in a very short-term period, in the next 25 or 30 years, that's all we have, can that be done?
Thank you, and sorry, I did learn some German at school, but it mainly gets me train tickets and coffee, so...
Okay, well, that's enough to stay alive, no problem.
Yes, exactly. So actually the presentation we just heard was problematic for me in a different way, which is that I'm launching a campaign on Monday called Climate Optimism. And so to hear that, the founding talk there about pessimism, I was thinking, okay, this is interesting. The reason that we're starting to talk more and more about optimism is that not that we think climate change is a good thing, we've seen these terrible pictures in the last couple of weeks, but actually that we're seeing this huge momentum for action coming from different levels. And we're seeing action happening, and we think that that news isn't necessarily getting out there. And the action we're seeing, we're here today talking about under 2, so we're seeing a lot from states and regions. We also work with businesses and at the local level, and we're seeing lots of different actions bubbling up, and that there are climate solutions out there and change is happening. So take something like solar. We've seen the price of solar really fall over the last few years. And a few years ago, no one would have thought that solar could reach the uptake that it's had. And yet here we are now with much higher rates of solar than was foreseen because the price fell. So a lot of this, as he said, is about price signals and getting those right. I think with electric vehicles as well, we've seen a whole lot of innovation around batteries and the technologies. We're launching at Climate Weeks next week, and we're launching something called EV100, which is a corporate commitment to electric vehicles, where companies are going to be both committing to their own fleet going electric, but also putting out charging points and the charging infrastructure that we need. So those are businesses seeing the business case, even in the absence of some of these price signals, and saying, when you look at the next 10, 20 years, the internal combustion engine is going, electric vehicles are the way forward, and they're spearheading that change. So I think when you look across cities, states, businesses, you start to add up the action that's happening, we're actually getting towards meeting the NDCs, the commitments under the Paris Agreement, and that's why we have a lot of cause for optimism. So I haven't directly answered the coal point, but more looking at those other technologies that are there.
Das ist schon okay. Also ich lerne daraus, Frau Zimmermann, und
so I can see, Ms. Zimmermann, that would be my question to you, in the extent to it where the alternatives are getting better and show that they're high performant, also in terms of financial feasibility, which is guaranteed, that it's not so as expensive as the renewable energies were at the beginning. We've moved on from that. So in that extent, that is how I understood Ms. Clarkson, the probability that a switch will really work. What about the ICLEI members? We've got a lot of utility companies, urban utility companies in the rural area, where a lot of electricity supplies are very closely linked to the municipalities. They've got shares. The municipalities actually earn from coal-fired electricity. So what can you say about that? I've got two options. Either I give you fantastic examples, or I can be a little bit pessimistic as well. I'm going to try and combine the two. Of course, we are very close to the cities who started very early with ambitious targets and who actually took action. 25 years ago, we had the first programs with cities where there were no organizations, no countries actually talked about that. And since the very first climate conference, we are a part of this conference representing the cities and regions. And of course, there are fantastic examples. I can tell you later on of a network where the cities are getting together who want to focus on 100% renewable energies and committed themselves with different timelines, of course. So they're extremely good, ambitious examples. And our work, if we bring them together and we learn from one from the other, if the mayor hears of a good project and goes home and implements that, something can happen. And I'm especially interested in the regions. And to gain momentum here on a regional level, we work very closely together. Maybe the Under 2 coalition is the small sister of our work. But we also know that the number of people on this planet is increasing. We know there's increasing urbanization, and we know that together with that, there is going to be a change in lifestyle, a change in how many resources the people think that they need to consume. We know that the use of resources, energy is only one resource in an urban lifestyle, but other resources are increasing as well. And if we look at this trend, the use of resources, I have to say that a lot of the improvements and the good examples and the visible good improvements that we have is just basically eaten up by the increase of growth of population and urbanization. I saw a report of the situation of transportation systems by the OECD. Millions of cars that are put on the streets on an annual level in these cities is so huge that we can basically forget the discussion on electric mobility. We have an increase of problems, and this is the pessimistic part of my statement. All of that is going to eat up what we've actually achieved. That doesn't mean we should just sit back. I'm coming out of this conference and say we have to do even more. We have to wake the people up even more. And I think the communal level is very good, but we have to look at the limits of the municipal and communal level, and we have to include the regional level. Mr. Edenhofer also said that we can't continue in the same system and use green elements to fight the others. That is not going to work, especially in the transportation sector. Mr. Aguilar, the German railway has a huge trump. It can be a very green means of transportation. But there are 2 points which are a little bit critical. When is the railway enterprise not going to use coal-fired electricity anymore? And why aren't you supporting freight so that lorries can get off the roads? Well, these are great questions. We as a company said that in 2050 we're going to have zero to CO2 emissions, and we know we have to look at the environment and the economic factors and bring the two together. And this is the biggest transportation company in Germany, and if we only look at the returns, then we're going to be wiped off the market. But if we only look at green, we would have to look at cargo, and we have to look at the regional transportation, then we will get off the market. If we only have the regional transportation system, the various companies order something and then we bid, and if we are higher because of the use of renewable energies, then we will lose the tender. We just won't get the placement. So we have to try and bring 2 things together. And if I look at cargo, I'm glad that you're not talking about Rastatt. That is just a problem area at the moment for the German railway company. And we have to talk about a level playing field as well, and I can have a discussion before. If I look at the electrician tax, if I look at the levies due to the renewable energy law, then the railway isn't on a level playing field compared to road traffic. So we have to try and reduce the section prices for cargo, and that is a precondition in order to get cargo freight away from the road onto the rails. And the 60 million tons which have to be reduced in the transportation sector, that is an absolute target. And if the framework conditions were right, we, the German railway company, could contribute 9 million tons in savings if we just shift some of the cargo traffic onto the railway. But we don't have the framework conditions yet. We ourselves have to improve, not only the regions and the other areas. We are looking at alternative drive systems. We are looking at energy-saving driving behavior. So if I look at cargo, we have a challenge that sometimes we just don't have enough people. We need engine drivers who can work all the shifts. We don't have those. So we are trying to solve these problems. These are homemade problems, but once we solve that problem, then we will be able to hold up with the areas. So we've reached a point again that there's something wrong with the system. We've got an environmentally friendly means of transportation which is confronted with the same competition as the others. Others are using dirty diesel, but they will win a tender because they're a few euros cheaper. Shouldn't it be the other way around? If I'm a passenger, you could ask the passenger, if you pay 2 euros extra, you can have a green ticket, but it should be the other way around. If you buy a green ticket, it should be cheaper rather than more expensive. I think I don't know anything about the tenders in regional transportation. I don't think that the railway didn't get the tender because it offered green electricities and the other didn't. There are other areas. For example, mistakes in the tenders. I don't want to go into detail here. You just made technical mistakes in the tender, and some other people got the bid. And what happened? What they are offering in terms of quality is not due to the fact that they are using diesel vehicles, but they've got new materials. These are electrical vehicles with new materials, and they are cheaper than the railway. So you have to ask yourself, why can't you keep up with them? But it's not due to the fact that they are basically driving down on the roads with dirty fuels, and you didn't win the bid unfairly.
So when there's a bid for regional transport, then if the bid or the tender demands that 100% green electricity is used, then for you it would be the same whether it's Deutsche Bahn that wins the bid or another regional company. So through the structure and the history of our company, our big company, we are faced with certain challenges. If on top we use more expensive electricity from renewables, then we have an additional disadvantage on the market. So we are talking about margins here. So if we give in a bid and make a bid and go beyond the specifications or the requirements, then of course we have a problem. So if it would be normal to demand 100% electricity from renewables, then that would be a different issue, and then of course we would have to work hard to then win the bid. So if we give out such a tender and others would do the same service for half the price, then you would do this. So that in future we could offer about twice the amount of kilometers on the railroads at a better price. Then we would be mad not to accept the bid of your competitors, and the Court of Audit wouldn't like that either. So, but let's stick to the point that a rail system that uses electricity in particular of renewables, would be a contribution to preventing climate change. So what could Helen Clarkson, so, well, let's look to the States again, since I've just come back from the States. And the United States, in California, there's the idea to have high-speed train tracks from Los Angeles to Sacramento, for example, San Francisco to Sacramento. I saw one of those tracks, and I thought, well, something is missing here. Well, that was the electric power lines. So how can a state like California that is quite good already, how can they learn something? Where can they benefit?
Obviously, for shifts to these sorts of new infrastructure to work, electric vehicles is going to have to go with renewable energy. But obviously, if you put electric vehicles, whether that's rail or cars in, you've got the opportunity to switch the electricity source. So we need to move overall. But I think what these show is these are very complex systemic problems. And you take the idea of the
start from the very beginning.
Start at the beginning, talking about California. Thank you. So obviously with any electric vehicle system to work, for it to be a better, greener solution, it needs to then have a renewable energy as the source. So those two things need to go together. But with electric vehicles, you can change that source. So it's worth putting them in, even if you have to, wherever you do it, then change the source later. And that's why we're seeing, particularly with motor vehicles, the car companies committing to get rid of the combustion engine and move to EV. But I think the bigger point here is that these are very systemic issues. I mean, we hear just in that discussion, the difficulties these things go out. We're reaching the point now with climate where probably the easy things should have been done by now in most places. And so we get into these more complex discussions. And that's where the Under 2 comes in, and the idea behind the Under 2 coalition is how can the members learn from one another. So we have something working at the moment called the Energy Transition Platform, where we bring 11 states together. It was led by North Rhine-Westphalia, and then we have Alberta, Minnesota, Wales. So these highly industrialized regions that have that similar economy together to learn how can we borrow policy from one another, can we leapfrog in policy and move the agenda on? Because if every single one of these decisions and policies has to be worked out by each state going alone, it is going to take us too long to get there. And the science that we saw earlier is telling us that the problem is running away from us. So the whole idea of the Under 2 coalition is to really start leapfrogging, to start borrowing policy, to accelerate the rate of action, to learn from one another, both within Europe and then across to other countries. And that's, I think, how a country even like California can be part of that coalition and learn from others. It's not all, 2 or 3 states telling everyone else what to do. It's really a kind of cross-learning platform.
Mich würde interessieren, wie konkret ist es am Ende?
So how concrete is that? Is this just a talking shop where everybody comes together and they pat each other on their back and applaud each other? But is this about concrete implementation of concrete or specific projects, and where people can say, through our cooperation, the Under 2 coalition, we saved so and so many tons of CO2, or we implemented a wonderful project? Are there any examples? Could you maybe tell us something about some of those examples, or report on wonderful things here?
I gave was one example. It's quite early days for the Under 2. It's definitely not about patting each other on the back, but it is about that peer learning. And so that group came together in the Basque Country. We went and visited some things that Basque Country were doing, but actually worked through some quite detailed examples. For example, Minnesota has a solar community project, solar community energy project, which is going very well. And so Wales and Minnesota were looking at, can we just take that policy and implement it wholesale? Now the answer turns out to be no. So they haven't done that yet, but they've got a lot learning in that process through, well, what would they need to do, how would they need to adapt it, and so on. So it is a long process. It's not that you form this straight away in their examples, but we have 3 lines of action for the Under 2. First of all is around creating pathway projects, so setting out pathways to 2050. As we've heard, it's very complex, and we need to help each of those jurisdictions. There are 179, I think, today. Each of those needs a path out now to 2050. And some of those are in developing countries. So the question is going to come, how do you develop and not have the sort of lives that we have here in terms of emissions, but you have the quality of life? And so keeping their emissions down is going to be as much of a problem as they develop as our sorts of economies reducing. So across the piece, there's a lot of work to do, there's a lot to learn. So that's the emissions pathway work. We also have a piece of work just on transparency and measuring, so both measuring emissions as they are now, but also building the capacity of countries to measure their emissions. We're going to be doing some joint work with ICLEI on that, so how do we build the capacity for countries? That one's looking particularly at Mexico. And then, as I said, the policy learning piece, where we are starting to bring countries together, regions and states together to look at policy solutions.
Okay, Frau Zimmermann, vielleicht können Sie ergänzen mit, oder dann hier Unterstelle.
Mrs. Zimmermann, maybe you can add to that. Well, I think we probably work very similarly. I want to illustrate that with the topic of urban transport. This gives us a lot of cause for worry, because those who are believed to be the leading countries and the best organized countries in terms of transport still have big emissions resulting from transport. We have we have an ideal of a inner urban transport. It consists of small individual means of transport, if you need a car, for example, but other means of transport like walking or bikes, and we can say that car sharing, for example, and that if you have to use a car in the city, then it should be a small car, a light car, and not one of those SUVs. So we formed an alliance of those cities who are ahead, and about 25 of those cities that are leading in terms of this kind of transport in the world, and we are watching them. Some of them are very good. They have wonderful programs and good figures for bicycle cities with 30 to 40% of bike traffic in their modal split, and others have a good public transport system, but only 2 to 3% goes to bikes. So if they learn from each other and they see what the others do, and then go home and say, well, it actually works, then they get more motivation out of that, derive a lot of new motivation out of that. And in addition, we say, so we do not only have this exchange at a political level or at a technical level, so the mayor goes home after a conference and says, well, I learned something from my colleagues, so please, people in my administration, look into that. No, we also want to derive some political momentum out of that. So we have strong political activities underway that want to merge all these individual local activities to derive figures out of that and to transport that feed that into the political debate. So maybe we could mention the COP conference in Bonn in November, because that is our big piece of work now to get prepared for that. So for more than 25 years, we've been fighting, ever since we had these conferences, we are fighting for giving the local authorities a voice so that they actually do their bit to these measures, and that their share, their contribution to that is recognized, so that they are regarded as a serious partner in this worldwide effort, and that in the end they will also benefit from the resources that maybe will be made available for this shift, and that the framework conditions will be changed accordingly. So we just heard that CO2 tax would probably be more efficient than any effort that we do on the ground. So many of the local activities on the ground compensate the inactivity of the governments. If we had better framework commissions, we could probably focus on even more ambitious activity and objectives, and wouldn't have to compensate for the failure to act at other levels. So maybe you could continue here from the experience of the Under 2 coalition, maybe 2 mayors from completely different cities, but on a level playing field to some extent meet, because they work in similar structures or in comparable structures because they're faced with similar problems and challenges on the ground. So you don't have to go to the big national level, but you can look at the local level. So is that also the idea, that it is easier to achieve this meeting on a level playing field in this forum? So you have to look back 3 years. In 2014, after the Intersolar in San Francisco, I had the possibility, Ken Alex was there as well, and I had the opportunity to meet Governor Brown and people from his staff. The background of that was that all World Climate Conferences until then, Cancun, Copenhagen, Doha, Lima, there had never been a positive impetus from that. So that one could have said, well, this is going into the right direction. And there was also the threat that Paris would be a failure, just following in the footsteps of the others. So it became more and more difficult to get the interest of the world community for the topic of climate change or climate protection. In San Francisco, if we discuss the issue as to whether it wouldn't make sense to send out a signal from a regional level, from two economically strong regions, and that we actually say clearly that we want this 2-degree target to be successful and so on. Well, Governor Brown said, well, that's quite good, let's get together. And the idea of the Under 2 coalition is that we do not only commit ourselves to these 2-degree or 2 tons, but that in the end, as a region, you have to say what your contribution is to achieve that objective. So all the regions are structured differently. California has more emissions in the transport sector, less emissions in the energy supply sector, for example. So this differs, and as a result, the different catalogs of measures of these 175 are very different. So they all have different catalogs of measures. Like these 175 regions come from 6 different continents. And what we can do and what we will do in the next few years with the money that we now have from different sources, the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States, for example, and also we are grateful for that. Here I have to thank Jochen Flassbart, so the National Climate Initiative, which is part of the Federal Ministry of the Environment. We got 3.5 million euros from them. So for the whole topic of measuring, reporting, verification, and make headway with these issues, in particular for those regions who cannot afford anything like that. We do that anyway, and California does it anyway, and others in Europe and the United States do that as well. But those on the southern hemisphere of our Earth have some problems with making headway with the topic of measuring, verification, and reporting, and we support them with that. And of course, this is also about sharing information. So transfer of technology, of knowledge, things like that. So to promote that through our alliance. And when at that time California said that, well, the aspiration was until Paris to have 100 members of our coalition, I said, well, we won't succeed in that. We will fail. And I pleaded to start on a smaller scale, but that's how the Americans are. If they are convinced of something, then they think big. And we managed to get 120 regions to join us until Paris, and now we are the biggest subnational alliance the world over. And at the COP23 in Bonn, we will also chair a number of panels and side events. Governor Brown will be there, my premier will be there, also from other member regions. And I think, well, apart next to the national or the states, the big countries, the national level, it's the regions that are important. We are closer to the citizens. There's an advantage, while local authorities are even closer to citizens. So I think it makes sense that we cooperate more closely with ICLE now, and the climate and the climate group in London is very good. They have joined us. We benefit from their experience, and I think the structure that we now have with this new face that is the chair. What's her name from Costa Rica? The chairperson, Christine Figueras. She's leading the climate group, and so with her we have somebody who has a lot of experience, former president of the UN Climate Secretariat, So I think I enjoy that. It's great fun to push forward with this topic. So I think this is an inevitable development. Mr. Gebhardt, you were also part of international agreements. There's not only German railways, but also others. Just a catchwork here, which was mentioned before. Of course, a transport operator has to be as environmentally friendly as possible. But the other topic is, what is networking? So what examples do you have? What are your objectives? What do you need in order to implement the topic of international networking? What are your favorite partners? So I wouldn't talk about the international level. I think we still have to do our national homework. So everything is under one roof with Deutsche Bahn. So we have Flinkster, which is car sharing project, also the regional railways and also long distance railways. So we are working on establishing a kind of platform where we bring everything together. And the first step would be to get this networking effort on the rail in Germany. So how to get to the station, for example. So there are some enthusiasts of stations or railways, but there are very few of them only. So most people do not really want to go to a big station. So there's some. So we have to deal with the whole chain from door to door, basically. And of course, we also are engaged in an exchange with international railways. But the first step would be to do our own homework. So I'm looking at you, ladies and gentlemen. At the beginning, I said very optimistically that we would like to open up the floor to you, and well, time is almost up, but I am very pleased to also include you with a very short question from, so these 179 regions that are part of that, is the EU one region, or is it the 27? No, it's some of the federal states in Germany. It's some of the states in the United States, for example, I think 12 to 13 American states. So we have regions or states in Canada, like Quebec, Ontario, then Mexican states, states in Panama, Catalonia, in Spain. So it's the regional level, the sub-national level that is involved here. Any further questions? And it is also part of that. So we also have endorsing partners, that is nations or countries, smaller countries like Luxembourg. They support us in our efforts.
I would like to know what you think about the CO2 price. I think that is very good. I'm very close to Mr. Edendover. We're on the same board with Angora, and we discussed that a great deal. We wrote a proposal which we didn't put into the election campaign, because I know how this is something torn apart during a campaign, and I don't want to see any headings in the newspapers as to whether the drivers of cars should pay the energy transition. But we need to have a debate about what we just said. We need a tax reform. We have to get rid of the electricity tax. The introduction of the renewable energies resources has to be excluded, and the compensation rules and regulations, which is 1.5 cents, where we as private citizens have to support the energy-intense companies. If you take all of that out, then we would reduce the electricity price by 5 cents, and all of that would account for 18 billion euros in Germany. We don't have to go to Mr. Schäuble. He won't let us in. It doesn't make sense. So it makes sense that we would say the old world pays for the new world. And in a situation where the fossil fuels are so low priced as they are today, we need an incentive. We need a CO2 price, which could be 50 euros, 60 or 70 euros a ton, and then allocated to oil, gas, and fuels. And if, in view of the low oil price, the liter for 60 cents, you would pay 70 or 80 cents per liter. But we are still below the price that you and I have seen. And the same applies to gas and diesel prices. They would get more expensive, but they're still below the prices that we once experienced. But what we hope that way, this would be an efficiency incentive in the heating sector, i.e. sector coupling. Everybody's talking about electric mobility, and instead we are making the electricity expensive and the fossil fuels cheap. That doesn't match. So after the election campaign, we need to have this debate. And if I am there, we will initiate it. And if we're not part of the government, we will see what we're going to do. One last question. Mr. Untersteller, I'm from the GIZ. We cooperate with you in the Under 2 coalition. If Baden-Württemberg wants to position itself with national climate change and has a lot of automobile industry and doesn't want to put pressure on the automobile industry, there are other possibilities. You could do it positively. One of the big breaks for electric mobility is the fact that the reach and there are no fast charging stations. And has anybody ever thought about saying that we as a state are going to invest and put 5,000 or 10,000 fast charging stations, and Daimler should change its fleet? Well, exactly that's what we're going to do with the electric mobility initiative number 3. So we're going to create a network. Let me give you one example. 2 years ago, my wife and I got an electric car. My wife didn't want it because she said there isn't enough reach. So we had a quarrel about that. Today, we still quarrel after 2 years, but we only talk about who's going to get the car, who's allowed to drive it, because all of us enjoy driving this car more than any of the other cars or any other way. So how fast is it? My minister-president said, and some people listened to him say, and I had a debate with him as well about my personal opinion. Thatcher, as the head of Daimler, called the minister-president a couple of months ago and relating to the strategy relating to the automobile sector, and said we as a group in 2021 will have 6 or 7 models for electric vehicles. So let's say these models have a range of 400 or 500 kilometers. We know that this is possible. A company from California has shown that this is possible. So let us assume that the products that they're going to be developed will cost 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 euros more than the vehicles today. So my question is, who wants to buy and has to buy an electric vehicle then would you take the product of the old world, and who's going to take the product of the new world? And I can tell you now, almost everybody is going to decide or opt for the new world, because they're afraid that if they opt for the old world in 6, 7 or 10 years, the products of the old world can't be sold on the market, because there won't be a used car market, and if there is a market, you won't get any money for that. So we can see what we experienced in other areas already. There used to be a company from Finland, which you can look at in the Technical Museum in Munich, because we all have these things in our pocket that we just swipe with our fingers. And at the time, they thought that they would continue with their keys. Things can happen very quickly. So I think together with the industry in our state, and you said Baden-Württemberg is a central player, we have to make sure that if these developments are so quick, we create the preconditions. That includes infrastructure, but it also includes lots of other things. For example, the topic of the networks and the grids, are they there? if 100,000 or several million vehicles are on the road, that their needs can be met, then we have to look at digitization, everything connected with that. So we're going to be doing that the next months and years together with the automobile industry, with research institutes, with the energy sector in Baden-Württemberg, as part of this strategic dialogue which the Minister-President started before the summer break. That is not only the case in Baden-Württemberg, but in a lot of other municipalities. We need the net infrastructure so that e-mobility will actually be possible for everybody, which is not the case today. Ms. Zimmermann, you mentioned earlier on COP23. Just a final round, and let's relate the Under 2 coalition to the COP23. What do you expect from the Bonn conference, which is actually a Fiji conference? What do you think could be the result of that? And what is your topic, the Under 2 topic? And also with you, Ms. Clarkson, how could that be driven forward? Or would you say the experience has been so bad we'll continue on our own? Well, we continued after Copenhagen as well, so we would, of course, continue. First of all, we expect that a few more visionary ideas can be brought forward. And I would not say new world for traffic. The new world is not that we all buy electric vehicles from a bigger company in Baden-Württemberg, but we need shared vehicles in a new world. We must have far fewer cars. We have to travel much differently, hopefully thanks to the German railway company, and that we look in a completely different direction, and that we don't add charging stations. I think I have nothing against charging stations, but I think this is completely the wrong concept. And when we come to Bonn, we want to be more radical, more comprehensive, and we now have the sustainability targets of the UN, the so-called SDGs. They're quite helpful. They're a tailwind because they force us to think in an integrative way. So we don't only look at energy producers on their own, but we look at lots of other factors as well. And secondly, in Bonn, we are the ones who just happen to be doing all the preparation, bringing everything together. But we want to have a summit. We've got a tradition of summits. And especially in the middle of the COP on Sunday, there's going to be one day where all the celebrities are going to come from a municipal, local, and regional world. And we've invited people from America, of course, and the governor from California. We're going to show that what are the good examples are from Bonn. We're not only by saying what we're going to do, but how we jointly, as local authorities and regions, demand. And this will, apart from instruments such as taxes and so on, we need to have a link between the local, regional, and the national levels. And this has to be made far more clear, that we just pass everything on amongst each other, so that we don't have only the local authorities, some active regions who are on their own, and the national government doesn't honor this level sufficiently. And of course, we have to have very clear decisions pushed by us from the national governments. These are the negotiating partners. We have to set up ambitious targets, and that have to be implemented. And Fiji is the president, so we want to make sure that there's a program for the small island states. And our proposal is to look at the cities as well. The small island states have terrible urbanization, where they have the same problems on a small scale, less inhabitants, but the same problems. And we think that these small countries need special support so that the cities become resilient, make them fitter for what is coming, and we hope that we get the support of the German government. Well, Tanya Geller will actually really support you. What is your reaction to COP23? First of all, on the 4th of November, we are going to take the German delegation with a climate train to Bonn. And what I would wish for is that together with the regions, with the federal government and with us, we manage to develop attractive offers on the rail. But because only if we have attractive offers on the rail, we will be able to shift the traffic from the road onto the railway. And you said the railway Berlin-Munich in the middle of December. We're going to open a connection that is less than 4 hours. We have a factor 15 for, if you compare the railway to an aeroplane. So everything is going to shift to the benefit of the rail. So it has to be attractive for people to travel from Berlin to Munich, not via plane, but via the train. And if we want to have a climate effect, we need to have these attractive offers. If we can't manage to develop these offers jointly, then we won't be able to progress. So my wish would be that this climate conference in Bonn would be used on all the levels in order to develop these type of offers so that we can use the environmentally friendly railway better. But the railway can say that this a section such as Berlin-Munich always has problems as far as infrastructure is concerned. There are going to be local residents who will demonstrate against that. But the renaturation, the relandscaping on which accounted for several million euros, I think is really exemplary. I don't know this stretch of railway yet. I only know where we had a problem in Rastatt, where the railway actually dropped into a sinkhole. So that's a different matter. Helen Clarkson, what is your view of COP23?
Well, I will be going to COP23 by rail. It's only 4 hours from London, so I'm on board with that. What we're going to see at COP23, I think, is this real sense of an unstoppable force of action from the sub-national level. So I was in China the week after President Trump made his announcement about the Paris Accord, and I think, in the run-up to that, we'd seen businesses lobbying, we'd seen plenty of US states lobbying and saying, let's stay in. Obviously, we didn't want this announcement about the pullout, but what we saw in China a week later was actually a completely different reaction from the media in terms of it's still happening. We've seen this pledge by US businesses, we're still in. We've seen lots of states step forward and say they're recommitted to Paris. So I think this COP is going to be about the non-state actors and about, even though it's a UNFCCC process, but we'll be holding an assembly for the states and regions for the under 2 coming together. We're going to see lots of announcements there about activities that are happening. And I think we're going to continue to push this message and show and demonstrate that we will solve climate change at this level. And this is the level of government at which change can really happen, and action is still continuing. So I think that message will come quite loud and clear from this COP. And hopefully I can then bring everyone else on this more optimistic journey.
Mit Sicherheit. Ja, vielen Dank, meine Damen.
Well, thank you very much. So the regions show that they are strong, and at COP23 that is going to be the case as well. And I feel that on a regional level, things are going to happen more quickly and more effectively than anywhere else. So we can think about whether that is true or not. You've got time now to have a cup of coffee. And you can go to the closed briefings as well and listen to further climate protection initiatives from the Under 2 Coalition and the GIZ. Use that opportunity if you wish, and we will start again at 15 or 6:15, 20 past 6 for the next round.